Liar Via could barely remember what warmth felt like. The air inside her cell was stale, thick with the sharp tang of recycled oxygen and the faint, sickly scent of burning circuitry. The metal floor beneath her was frigid, numbing her legs where she sat curled against the wall. Her once pristine robes, woven from the soft silken fibers of her home world, were now stiff with dried blood and grime. A deep bruise stretched along her ribs from where one of the guards had struck her days ago. Or had it been weeks? Time had become meaningless in this metal prison. The energy field surrounding her cell hummed softly, a near-invisible barrier of crackling blue light that made the air feel charged, heavy whenever she moved too close. The static nipped at her skin like a living thing, warning her against escape. She had learned that lesson early. Her first attempt had sent a surge of energy through her limbs so violent that her vision had blackened for hours. So she sat and she waited for her captors to sell her to some distant, faceless buyer, waited for the moment her identity would be erased, her name reduced to a number in a ledger, waited for death. She had not been weak before the ambush, before the betrayal, before the cold shackles had locked around her wrists and torn her from the home she had sworn to protect. Lyra was Methan, a daughter of the Emerald Moons, born under twin suns, raised in the noble houses of her people. Her kind were known for their elegance, their wisdom, their long lifespans and rich culture. Once she had been a diplomat, a keeper of peace between the stars, her voice carrying the weight of centuries-old treaties. But to the galaxy's black markets, she was nothing more than a rare commodity. Her green skin, smooth and luminous under the right light, marked her as an exotic prize. The long, silky strands of her black hair, which had once been braided with silver beads to signify her rank, now hung in tangled waves down her back. Her violet eyes, once filled with purpose, were dull from exhaustion. The Orothan Syndicate had taken her, ruthless slavers and war profiteers. They had struck in the dead of night, tearing her from her ship before her guards could react. Her people's treaties, their diplomacy, their carefully woven alliances, none of it had mattered when the enemy struck from the shadows with the intent to profit from her captivity. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She had vowed not to break, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her weep. But as the days dragged on, as hope withered, she wondered how much longer she could last. Then the alarm screamed. A deep, pulsing wail flooded the corridors, followed by the sharp, echoing blasts of gunfire. The ship trembled, metal groaning as explosions thundered through its halls. Distant shouting erupted, frantic voices barking orders over the intercom. This wasn't a standard attack. This was slaughter. Layer V pressed herself against the cell wall, her breath shallow. Through the energy bars, she caught glimpses of movement, shadows flickering in the flashing red emergency lights. Then heavy footsteps, steady, unrelenting, not Syndicate, someone else. And then he stepped into view. A human. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, his battle-worn armor streaked with soot and blood. His dark hair was damp with sweat, matted against his forehead, a fresh gash above his brow dripping red down his temple. He moved like a man who had been fighting for hours, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths, muscles taut with exertion. But his grip on his weapon remained firm, his gaze locked on hers. Dark eyes sharp and assessing, took in her caged form. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a word, he strode toward the control panel beside her cell and drew a plasma blade from his belt. With a single precise slash, he cut through the panel, sending a shower of sparks across the floor. The energy field flickered, then died. The door hissed open. Liar V didn't move. This was not one of her captors, but that did not mean he was her savior. The human exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. "You waiting for an invitation?" His voice was rough, edged with exhaustion, but steady. Lyervia hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, and yet she remained rooted to the spot, her pulse hammering in her throat. He took a step closer. "Look, lady, I don't know what the hell they wanted with you, but this ship is going down in flames." He jerked his chin toward the distant explosions. "Unless you want to burn with it, move." Still she hesitated. Something flickered across his face. Impatience, then something softer. Understanding. His voice lowered. "You want to live?" She swallowed, then with great effort forced her legs to move. The moment she stepped forward, his hand shot out, gripping her wrist. Firm, but not cruel. His palm was rough, calloused, warm. "Stay close," he ordered. "I didn't come all this way just to lose you now." She barely had time to react before the ceiling above them exploded. A shockwave knocked her backward, heat searing across her face. The ship lurched violently, sending debris raining down from the upper decks. The human yanked her forward, shielding her with his body as flaming wreckage crashed toward where she had been standing seconds before. A guttural snarl echoed through the smoke. Liar V's blood ran cold. The syndicate wasn't finished yet. From far into the corridor, armored enforcers emerged, weapons raised, their cybernetic implants gleaming under the emergency lights, red lenses scanning for targets. The lead soldier, a towering brute with twin ion rifles strapped to his arms, let out a sharp metallic laugh. "Kill the human," he growled. "The girl stays." The human warrior's grip on her wrist tightened. "Yeah," he exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Good luck with that." Then, in one fluid motion, he shoved her behind him just as the gunfire began. Layer V barely had time to process what happened next. The human moved with brutal efficiency, weaving between blasts of plasma with an almost instinctive grace. He wasn't just fast. He was relentless, his every strike precise, every movement calculated for maximum destruction. He drove his blade into the nearest attacker, spun and tore a rifle from another's grip before snapping his neck with a sickening crunch. A stolen ion pistol discharged in his hand, dropping two more before they could react. In less than 10 seconds, the corridor was silent again. Layer V's breath came in short, uneven bursts. The human turned back to her, chest still rising and falling from exertion. "You still breathing?" She nodded numbly. "Good," he extended a hand. "Because we're not done yet." Layer V stared at him, then at the bodies at his feet. This man was dangerous, ruthless. But as the alarm screamed, as the ship burned around them, she knew one thing for certain. If she wanted to survive, she had to trust him. So she took his hand, and they ran. The ship was falling apart. Flames spewed from shattered bulkheads, sending thick black smoke curling through the corridors. Sirens blared, their shrill wails mingling with the distant, sporadic bursts of gunfire. The air reeked of scorched metal and burning flesh. Layer Vela ran, her bare feet pounding against the cold floor, the human warrior's grip firm around her wrist as he pulled her forward. She had no idea who he was or why he was here, but he was her only way out. A deafening explosion tore through the hallway behind them, the shockwave knocking her off balance. She stumbled, barely catching herself before she hit the ground. The human didn't stop. He yanked her back to her feet without hesitation. "Move," he barked. She obeyed. There was no time for questions, no time to demand answers. Her lungs burned as they sprinted through the smoke-filled corridors, dodging debris, and the occasional syndicate enforcer unlucky enough to cross their path. The human took them down effortlessly, his movements swift and lethal. A blade to the throat, a shot between the eyes, a crushed windpipe. Efficient, merciless. Layer V had never seen a human fight before. Their kind had a reputation, wild, unpredictable, driven by an almost primal instinct. She had dismissed those stories as exaggerations, myths spun to paint them as more formidable than they truly were. She had been wrong. "Where's your ship?" she finally managed between ragged breaths. "Docking bay," he answered, voice clipped. "Got to blast through security first." The docking bay. That meant they still had to fight their way past the last line of syndicate defenses. Layer V clenched her teeth. They were so close, but not close enough. They rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. A dozen Orovan syndicate enforcers stood between them and the exit, their weapons raised, their cybernetic eyes gleaming red in the emergency lighting. The largest of them, a towering brute with twin ion cannons grafted to his forearms, stepped forward. "That's far enough," he growled, his voice guttural, synthetic enhancements distorting the words. His gaze flicked between the human and Layer V. "Turn around, and we might let you live." The human exhaled slowly. He released Layer V's wrist and rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on his blade. His posture shifted, weight settling, tension coiling in his stance like a predator sizing up its prey. Lyra took a step back. Then, without warning, the human moved. It was savagery and precision combined, a dance of brutality unlike anything she had witnessed before. He lunged into their ranks, cutting through them like a storm-given form. His plasma blade sliced through armor, severing limbs and cauterizing wounds in the same motion. Blood, black, green, red, splattered against the walls. A gunshot rang out, the sharp crack echoing through the corridor. Liar Via flinched, expecting pain, but it wasn't hers. The human staggered, a fresh wound blooming across his side. The brute with the ion cannon sneered. Not so fast, human. Larvaila reacted before she could think. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for war. She had spent her life in embassies, in council chambers, negotiating peace between civilizations. She had sworn an oath to protect life, not take it. But right now, none of that mattered. Her fingers found the discarded plasma rifle at her feet. She barely knew how to use the weapon, but instinct guided her. She raised it, aimed at the brute's exposed throat, and fired. The shot burned through flesh and metal alike. The brute let out a gurgling snarl, collapsing as smoke curled from the gaping hole in his neck. The remaining syndicate enforcers hesitated. The human didn't. He finished what she started. And then, just like that, the corridor fell silent. Liar V stood frozen, her pulse hammering. The rifle still clenched in her trembling hands. She felt sick. The human stepped closer, his dark eyes scanning her face. First time killing someone. She exhaled shakily. It should have felt like a victory. It didn't, yes, she admitted. Better him than you. His tone was neutral, but something in his gaze softened for a fraction of a second. Then, as if deciding not to press the issue, he jerked his chin toward the exit. Come on, we're running out of time. Liar Via forced herself to move, stepping over bodies as they pushed forward. The docking bay was just ahead. Freedom was just ahead. She was ready. She would not die in a cage. The stolen freighter drifted through the endless void, its engines humming beneath the metal floor. The ship was old, its systems patched together from years of makeshift repairs, and the air inside carried the faint scent of coolant and scorched wiring. Compared to the cold, sterile prison she had just escaped, it was a sanctuary. And yet Larvae felt no safer than she had in that cage. She sat on the edge of a narrow cot in the cargo hold, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to force her body to relax. Every part of her ached from the escape, the frantic sprinting, the fights, the adrenaline crash that had left her limbs trembling once they were finally off the syndicate ship. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. Not while she was trapped on a vessel with a man she barely knew. Cedric. That was his name. A human warrior, a killer with sharp eyes and a mouth that curled into a smirk far too easily for someone who had just torn through an entire squad of syndicate enforcers. He sat across the room, shirt peeled back to reveal a deep gash along his ribs. The wound was fresh, angry, still bleeding sluggishly despite the crude bandage he had pressed to it. Layer V wasn't sure why she kept watching him. Perhaps it was wariness. He had saved her life, but that didn't make him trustworthy. Humans were unpredictable. They fought with an almost reckless abandon, guided by emotions rather than strategy. Her people, the Mayans, found them crude, primitive even, despite their technological advancements. She had never met a human before Cedric. If she had, perhaps she would have known whether or not to be afraid. He must have felt her gaze because, without looking up, he muttered, "You're staring." She straightened, clearing her throat. "You're still bleeding." Cedric huffed out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, that happens when you get shot." Liar Via frowned. His tone was too casual for a man who had nearly died less than an hour ago. "You should let me treat it." His dark eyes flicked up to meet hers, assessing. "I'll live." "Not for long if it gets infected." She stood, moving toward him before she could second-guess herself. "A wound like that needs proper care. Unless humans have some unnatural resistance to sepsis, I suggest you let me help." Cedric let out a low sigh, leaning his head back against the bulkhead. "Fine. Knock yourself out." She knelt beside him, taking the mech-kit he had tossed onto a nearby crate. It was an old standard-issue field kit, likely scavenged from one of his previous jobs. As she pulled out a sterilizing cloth, she noticed his eyes on her, watching her hands with quiet curiosity. "You know what you're doing," he murmured. Liar V didn't look up. "I was trained in basic field medicine, part of the diplomat package." She paused, glancing at him. There was something in his tone, curiosity, yes, but also something deeper, something knowing. "You assume much about me, Cedric." He smirked. "You don't exactly look like a soldier. Not the type to get their hands dirty anyway." Liar V pressed the disinfectant pad to his wound with a little more force than necessary. He hissed, but to his credit, he didn't pull away. "I am not a soldier," she admitted, "but I was not defenseless either." My people do not believe in war, but that does not mean we are blind to it. Could have fooled me, he muttered. Not many diplomats would have taken a shot like you did back there. She stiffened, the memory of the syndicate enforcer collapsing to the floor, his cybernetic eyes flickering as the life drained out of him, flashed behind her eyelids. I had no choice, she said quietly. Cedric studied her for a long moment. Yeah, you did. V's fingers hesitated over the bandage. He didn't say it cruelly. There was no judgment in his voice, but the weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She finished dressing the wound in silence, securing the bandage tightly. When she finally sat back, she flexed her fingers, trying to shake the residual tremor from them. It will heal cleanly, she said, more for herself than for him. Good to know. He rolled his shoulder, testing the tightness of the wrap, then gave her a sideways look. Guess that makes you a doctor now. Liar Via tilted her head. Doctor. A nickname, he said with a smirk. Humans like giving them to people. She considered that. My people do not use them. Shame. You'd be fun to nickname. She gave him a flat look. I doubt that. Cedric chuckled. Despite herself, she felt the corner of her lips twitch. It faded quickly. She turned her attention toward the cockpit, her thoughts shifting to the inevitable question she had been avoiding. Where are we going? Cedric followed her gaze, his expression darkening. Somewhere safe. I got a few contacts in the outer systems. The moment the first blast hit, Liar V knew they were in trouble. The ship lurched violently, alarms blaring through the cockpit. Red emergency lights pulsed in frantic warning, bathing the metal walls in a flickering glow. The impact sent her sprawling against the console, the sharp edge biting into her ribs. Hold on, Cedric shouted, his hands flying over the controls. The second blast struck. The entire ship groaned in protest as the hull took the hit, metal shrieking under the force. The engine sputtered, then roared back to life in a desperate struggle to keep them airborne. Lar V gripped the co-pilot's seat, heart pounding. Shields gone, Cedric's jaw clenched, his fingers white-knuckled around the flight stick. Sons of, got a lock on us before I could jump. Outside the viewport, the planet loomed closer, a frozen wasteland of jagged mountains and endless tundra. Their descent was no longer controlled. It was a free fall. The third and final blast sent them spiraling. The ship spun violently, and Larvae was thrown against the bulkhead with a force that rattled her bones. Sparks erupted from the ceiling panels, smoke filling the cabin. Cedric cursed, wrestling with the controls, trying to level their descent. Brace for impact. The world tilted. The atmosphere howled around them as they plummeted. The last thing LV saw before everything blurred into chaos was Cedric's grim expression. Calm, focused, ready for whatever came next. Then impact. The ship slammed into the ice with a deafening crash, skidding across the frozen ground, tearing through jagged rock and snow drifts. The violent momentum threw Lyerville forward, her vision flashing white as pain erupted through her skull. Then silence. For a long moment, all she could hear was the ringing in her ears, the distant creak of settling wreckage. The ship lay broken and still, half buried in the snow. Lyervia forced herself to move, her limbs sluggish, her head pounding. She coughed, inhaling the acrid scent of burning metal. She was alive. That was the first thing. The second thing, Cedric. She twisted, eyes scanning the ruined cockpit. He was slumped over the controls, motionless, blood trickling from a gash above his brow. Panic surged through her. Husband. The word left her lips before she could stop it. She scrambled toward him, fingers shaking as she reached for his pulse. The moment she felt it, steadied, strong. Relief hit her like a wave. He was alive. But he wouldn't be for long if they stayed here. Lyervia sucked in a breath, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs as she unbuckled Cedric's harness. He groaned as she pulled him upright, his head lolling slightly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alert enough. Lyervia, his voice was rough, hoarse. You all right? She let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sigh. You are the one bleeding, and yet you ask if I am all right. A weak smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Guess that means we're both still breathing. The ship gave a metallic groan beneath them, the wreck settling deeper into the ice. They didn't have time. Lyervia hooked an arm under Cedric's shoulder, pulling him to his feet. He grunted, swaying slightly, but he didn't argue. He never did. Come on, she murmured. We need to get out of here before they send someone to finish the job. Cedric muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a curse, but he let her help him. They forced the cockpit door open, stepping out into a world of ice and wind. The storm had not yet arrived, but the sky was heavy with dark clouds, the promise of a blizzard looming on the horizon. The air was thin, frigid, sharp against her lungs. The wreckage stretched behind them, half buried in the snow, smoke still curling from the damaged engines. Lyervia tightened her grip on Cedric's arm. "We have to move." He nodded, but she could feel the tension in his body, the barely restrained pain. He was hurt worse than he let on. Typical human stubbornness. They trudged forward, each step crunching over the frozen ground. The wind howled through the valley, whipping her hair around her face. Lyervia had never been this cold before. She glanced at Cedric. He wasn't wearing enough layers for this kind of weather. His skin was pale beneath the blood, his breaths coming slower. Without a word, she shrugged off his oversized jacket, the one he had thrown over her shoulders 2 nights ago, and pressed it back into his arms. He frowned. "You need it." "You needed more," she countered. Cedric exhaled but didn't argue. He pulled the jacket on with stiff movements, then smirked at her. "Husband, ah." Lyervela stiffened, realizing what she had said in the ship. "I." "Oh, don't back out of it now," he teased, voice rough but amused. "I kind of like it." She scowled. "It is a term of familiarity." His grin widened. "So you're saying you're familiar with me?" Lyervia rolled her eyes, but the warmth in his voice, even through the exhaustion, even through the pain, made something settle in her chest. They walked in silence for a while, navigating the uneven terrain. The cold was relentless, seeping into her bones. Every step felt heavier, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Then a sound, distant but distinct. Engines. Alvail tensed. Cedric's posture shifted immediately, all humor gone. His hand went to his sidearm, movement slow but deliberate. A patrol ship. The Syndicate had found them. Lyervia's pulse quickened. "We cannot outrun them." "No," Cedric agreed, his voice low, steady, "but we can make sure they don't find us first." He grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward an outcropping of ice-covered rock. They pressed themselves against the frozen stone just as the patrol ship roared overhead, its searchlights sweeping across the tundra. Lyervia barely breathed. The ship hovered for a long moment, scanning the wreckage in the distance. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it veered off, disappearing into the storm. Cedric exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. Not the welcoming party I was hoping for. Lyervia swallowed hard. They weren't safe, not yet. Cedric turned to her, studying her face. "You all right?" She met his gaze, her breath still unsteady. "I will be." His lips quirked. "Good, because I don't plan on dying out here. Husband." Lyervia groaned, shoving him lightly. He laughed. A real, genuine laugh, before groaning at the pain it caused his ribs. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion, despite everything, she found herself smiling. The first scar, the first battle, the first bond. Neither of them had expected. And somehow, against all odds, they were still standing, together. The fire burned low, its glow casting flickering shadows against the ice-covered cavern walls. The wind outside had settled into a slow, haunting howl, weaving through the jagged cliffs like a living thing. The cold remained relentless as ever, seeping through the stone and into their bones. Lyervia sat close to the fire, knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in Cedric's oversized jacket. The scent of leather, metal, and something unmistakably human clung to the fabric. It was a ridiculous thing to focus on considering the circumstances, but exhaustion did strange things to the mind. Across from her, Cedric leaned against the cavern wall, his legs stretched out, his injured side still tightly bandaged. He was quiet, as he often was, but not in a way that suggested peace. His silence was a waiting thing, heavy with unspoken thoughts. His knife scraped against the wet stone in slow, methodical strokes, the rhythmic sound filling the empty space between them. She had watched him do this before, when he wasn't talking, when he was thinking, when he was waiting for something unseen. She should have left him to his thoughts, but the silence between them had stretched too thin. "You have been sharpening that blade for over an hour," she said at last, her voice soft but firm. Cedric didn't look up. "Didn't realize there was a time limit." "You were thinking about them," she pressed. "The ones who put us here." His hand stilled for just a second before resuming its steady rhythm. "I think about a lot of things." Lyervia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You're planning." That made him pause, just for a moment. Then he set the whetstone aside, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight. His dark eyes met hers, unreadable as always. She held his gaze, unblinking. "You do not trust me." "I don't trust anyone." She let that settle between them, watching him carefully. "Yet you saved me. That doesn't mean I trust you." Liar V exhaled, pressing her fingers into the fabric of his jacket. "And yet you are here, freezing in a cave, bleeding from your ribs instead of leaving me behind to fend for myself. If that is not a man worth trusting, then I do not know what is." He blinked, caught off guard. For the first time since she met him, Cedric seemed uncertain. He shifted slightly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight. "Starlight, you don't." She moved before she could think. Her fingers reached for his jaw, tilting his face toward her before he could look away. His stubble was rough beneath her touch, his skin warm despite the cold air. She saw the moment his breath caught. Then slowly, carefully, she leaned in and brushed her lips against his. It was hesitant at first, a whisper of a kiss, a question left unspoken. But when Cedric exhaled and pulled her closer, his fingers curling around her waist, the hesitation melted away. His lips were warm, firm, carrying the faint taste of fire and exhaustion. His grip was solid, grounding, like he was afraid to let go. Liar V hadn't known what to expect, but she hadn't expected this. The intensity, the way he kissed like he had nothing to lose yet everything to hold on to. The way her own body betrayed her, pressing closer instead of pulling away. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her fingertips, steady and strong in hers. Hers was no longer steady at all. The moment stretched, deepened, until finally Cedric pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. His breathing was uneven, matching hers. His lips quirked faintly. "So does this mean I get to keep the title?" Liar V groaned, shoving him lightly. "You are impossible." His laughter was low and warm, the sound vibrating through her where their bodies were still pressed together. "And yet," he murmured, brushing another kiss against her temple, "you keep calling me husband." She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her lips twitched upward despite herself. Cedric sighed, leaning back against the rock, keeping one arm loosely around her waist. "Get some sleep, Starlight. We move at dawn." Liar Via hesitated for only a moment before shifting closer, allowing herself to rest against his side. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt truly warm. And for the first time, she let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, they had a future worth fighting for. The wreckage stood before them, half buried in snow and ice, its metal hull warped and scarred from the crash. It was a miracle the ship had survived it all, let alone with a working engine. But miracles wouldn't get them off this frozen wasteland, work would. Liar Via took a deep breath, racing against the cold as she followed Cedric toward the broken remains of their last hope. If they couldn't fix this, they would die here. Cedric exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw as he inspected the damage. "All right, we're not completely screwed, just mostly." Liar Vela shot him a look, encouraging. "I aim to please." He crouched beside a torn section of the hull, running his fingers along the damaged plating. "Engines are buried under all this snow. We'll need to clear it out before I can check for damage." Liar Via nodded and knelt beside him, scooping icy powder away with her hands. It was slow, grueling work. The cold bit at her fingers, numbing them despite the insulated gloves she wore. Cedric was struggling too, his movements stiff, his breaths heavier than they should have been. She knew why. The wound was slowing him down. She glanced at him. "You should rest." Cedric snorted. "Yeah, sure. Let me just lie down in the snow and take a nap." "Cedric, I'm fine." He forced another chunk of ice aside. "Just keep digging." Larvia clenched her jaw but said nothing. It took them nearly an hour to clear the worst of the debris. By the time they finished, her limbs were shaking, her fingers raw. Cedric wasn't faring much better, his forehead slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. Finally, he stepped back and exhaled. "All right, let's see if she's still got a pulse." He pressed his palm against the control panel beside the main engine compartment. The interface flickered weakly, then died. Cedric cursed under his breath.